Good morning, boys and girls. Today we are reading a book that is titled The Nutty Nut Chase by Catherine White and Vanessa Cabin. Remember, this week we're still talking about fiction and nonfiction. Remember, fiction tells a story. The author wants us to read it for fun. In fiction, we have characters. Remember, characters are the people in the story. We know it's a character because they speak. They have speaking parts. They talk to one another. Sometimes our characters are humans, and sometimes they could be animals or robots. In nonfiction, we're learning about real, true information about a real person, real place, or real thing. The author writes the book to teach us about something, not so that we can have fun reading a story. So that's the difference between fiction and nonfiction. This week, we are also still working on asking questions. Remember, I've told you that all good readers ask questions. We ask questions before we read, while we're reading, and even after we are done reading. A lot of times, our questions are going to be based on these 5 things. Who, what, when, where, and why. A question is something that we want to know. As we're reading our story today, I want you to notice that I'm going to stop and I'm going to write down questions that I have. The Nutty Nut Chase. Hickory was making rude faces at Pecan when the strangest thing happened. Pop! A shiny brown nut suddenly burst up from the ground. It wobbled and shook, wibbled and quivered, then lay there, teasingly delicious. Boys and girls, I already have a question. I want to know, why was Hickory making rude faces at Pecan? That's not very nice. I'm going to stop and write down my question next to why. Wow, lunch, Pecan shouted. Wow, lunch and dinner, Hickory screeched. It's my nut, said Pecan. It's mine, snapped Hickory. Who's making that noise? Shouted Badger. I'm trying to sleep. All the animals came out to see what was happening. My nut, Pecan shouted. It's mine, yelled Hickory. I saw it first. Did not, did so. Bop his nose, shouted Littlest Rabbit. Certainly not. Bopping noses doesn't solve problems, said Badger firmly. There will be a competition, and the winner will get the nut. I know, said Hedgehog. The prickliest wins the nut. But you're the prickliest, said Pecan and Hickory. So I am, said Hedgehog, delighted. I win. I get the nut. Cuddliest gets the nut, said Littlest Rabbit. I win. Oh, boys and girls, I've got another question that I'm going to write on the board. Here's my question. Who is going to get the nut? That's my question because all of my characters are arguing about who is going to have it. So I'm wondering, who is going to end up with the nut? Let's see what happens. "Enough," said Badger. "We will have a race. First to reach the post wins." "Hooray! A race!" everyone cheered. Blackbird whistled the start of the race. They were off. Pecan and Hickory shot ahead, but the rabbits were close behind. Hedgehog tried to run, but only managed to waddle. In a huff, he curled himself into a ball and rolled full speed down the slope. Littlest Rabbit looked back to see a prickly ball spinning towards them. "Look out!" he called. Too late. Hedgehog crashed through the racers like a cannonball, and everyone landed in a prickly heap. "Oh dear," tutted Badger. "We'll have to start again, and prickly cannonballs aren't allowed." Hedgehog snorted and sulked off. Blackbird whistled and they were off again. Pecan and Hickory were neck and neck. "My nut!" shouted Pecan triumphantly. "I win!" "No!" shouted Hickory. "It's mine! I win!" Suddenly, the nut began to move. It twitched and jerked, joggled and jiggled until plop! It disappeared down under the ground. Oh, boys and girls, I've got another question. I'm going to stop reading and write my question on the board. Look at my question, boys and girls. It says, "What is inside the nut?" That's my question because the author described the nut as moving and twitching and jerking, joggling and jiggling. I wonder what's in it. "It's a magic nut!" shouted Littlest Rabbit. "Nutty magic!" squealed Hedgehog, racing back to see. "Bet it would have tasted magic too," said Shrew. Pop! The nut sprang up right in front of Shrew. "Quick, grab it!" shouted Littlest Rabbit. All the animals shot across the grass, rolling and shrieking, jumping and hopping, banging and bopping into each other. "I've got it!" shouted Hedgehog, but the nut vanished again. "That's my nose!" Shrew squeaked. Oh, boys and girls, I'm wondering, where did the nut go? The author says that the nut vanished. That's a fancy word for disappeared. It was nowhere to be found. So my question is, where did it go? Said Badger suddenly. "Look!" He pointed at the magic nut that had appeared at his feet. Everyone tiptoed up to it. The nut shook and quivered. The animals looked in amazement. "Help!" squealed the nut. "Ah!" shrieked Littlest Rabbit. "A talking nut! You're a talking nut!" said Pecan. "Help!" Pecan and Hickory bit down and pulled and tugged, yanked and wrenched at the nutshell with all their might. I'm going to stop and ask a question. Boys and girls, my question is, when will they find out what is inside the nut? Maybe they won't. Pop! Out flew the nutshell, sending Pecan and Hickory rolling backwards. And there, where the nut had been, was a mole. Mole shook himself and stood up on his two tiny legs. "Thanks," he said. "I thought I would be stuck in that nutshell forever." Littlest Rabbit put the empty shell on his head. "It makes a great hat," he giggled. "That looked like the tastiest nut ever," groaned Pecan and Hickory. "There's plenty more where that came from," chirped Mole, and he disappeared underground. Suddenly, shiny nuts began popping up all over the place. "There's enough for everyone," Mole chuckled. "Pop, pop." "Magic!" shouted Hickory. "Magic!" shouted Pecan. "Nutty magic!" everyone shouted, and they all munched with delight. The end. Okay, boys and girls, let's talk about if we think our book is fiction or nonfiction. Remember, fiction is a make-believe story. Some of the clues that we have when we're reading fiction is that there are characters. Remember, characters are the people in the story that talk to one another. Nonfiction is true, real information about a real person, real place, and real thing. Now think about our book. We had lots of animals in our book, and we know that animals are real things. But did these animals speak to one another? Yes, they did. They were our characters in our book. So that means that this book is fiction. It is make-believe, and the author wrote this story for fun. The author wanted us to enjoy this story. We didn't learn real information about real animals. Now, let's talk about questioning. Remember, all good readers ask questions, and boys and girls, you watched me ask questions on the board as I was reading. I was showing you what a good reader does as they are reading a story. They stop and ask questions. Sometimes our questions can be answered as we're reading, and sometimes we are not going to find the answer. Let's take a look at our questions. Who is going to get the nut? Well, in this story, that question was answered. No one got the nut because the nut was really the mole. It wasn't a nut that you could eat. What is inside the nut? We found out what was inside the nut. It was Mole. He was trying to get out. When will they find out what is inside the nut? They found out what was inside the nut at the end of the story. Where did the nut go? We know that the nut went underground, and moles like to stay underground. You can read about more information about moles on your own time. And why? Why was Hickory making rude faces? Well, boys and girls, we never found the answer to that question. So that's something that we weren't able to answer, and we'll never find out the answer to. I hope that you enjoyed this story. I hope that you are better understanding the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And I hope that you are practicing asking questions as you read with your grown-up at home or online with Epic. See you guys later.